Chapter 17, The Renaissance and the Reformation. Section 1, The Renaissance. We'll start out today by talking about Marco Polo. Marco Polo was an Italian trader who published a story of his journeys through Asia, especially China. We kind of talked about him in a couple chapters ago when we talked about the Mongols and the Mongol Empire and Kublai Khan and his dynasty there in China, where Marco Polo visited, stayed there for quite a number of years as his kind of right-hand man, if you will. Anyway, he goes back to Italy and writes this book while he was in jail. And his book encouraged European merchants to increase trade with that part of the world. Once stability returned to Europe, people wanted to achieve greater knowledge, so they turned to the ancient Greeks and the Romans. So it's a revival of classical learning. One of the movements that grew during this time period was called Humanism. Humanism was a way of thought on human beings and their potential for achievement. And humanists focused on creating a well-rounded individual. Where during the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, attention was focused on the church. Now, with humanism, people are focused on the human being rather than the church. So what we're talking about in this chapter is the Renaissance. If you were to translate Renaissance into English, that means rebirth. It is the rebirth of classical learning with the Greeks and the Romans, and the creating of new styles and ways of thinking, beginning around 1300 in the country of Italy. One of the most important and influential cities of the early Renaissance was called Florence. If you're looking at our map right here, actually let's draw a little circle around it. Florence is right here. And within the city of Florence, there was a very powerful banking family known as the Medici. And the Medici were very huge patrons of the arts. That means that they gave money to the arts. A new art technique that was developed during this time period was called perspective, and that is, perspective gave works of art an appearance of depth and distance in works of art. So, for example, looking at this picture, you can see that maybe it's coming from a distance here. Ooh, let's put the marker on here. Coming from a distance. So you can see how it looks like it's traveling in a row, and really it's not doing that. Here's a perfect example of that with this picture right here. This is called the School of Athens. And you can see how it's using perspective to show that these philosophers right here are walking toward us from a long hallway. We are now going to talk about some Renaissance artistes. The first one, Leonardo da Vinci, who is known as the Renaissance man, which means he excelled in lots of areas. For example, astronomy, geometry, anatomy, inventing, and painting. Some of his more famous works of art is the Mona Lisa right here. That's the Mona Lisa. And The Last Supper. This is actually a self-portrait of Leonardo. He looked at a piece of glass or a mirror and painted himself. Michelangelo is the second of our big artists. He painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which was attached to the St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. That's a scene of God. Here's Michelangelo himself with his own self-portrait. Here's a statue he created called the Pieta. That's Mary with the dead body of Jesus. And here's a statue of David. Raphael painted this famous painting of the School of Athens. So these are the big philosophers here walking down the corridor. And this picture right here called Little Angels. Now, when we talk about the early Renaissance, we're talking about mainly in Italy, in the cities like Florence, or Venice, or Milan, or Rome. But eventually, the Renaissance will start to spread and go up north into Europe. And so you see some Renaissance painters up in European countries like Belgium and Germany. Here's a guy named Albrecht Dürer, who painted himself here. It's a self-portrait of himself. He's from Germany. Then you have this guy, Jan van Eyck, who is from Belgium, and he paints this little Flemish couple here. And then again, Peter Bruegel from Belgium also painted a picture of the Tower of Babel, or Babel. Now, when we talk about Renaissance artists, I'm not just talking about painters and sculptors, we're also talking about writers. And so we have a number of writers here that we want to talk about. Dante Alighieri, who wrote The Divine Comedy and Dante's Inferno. You have Niccolo Machiavelli, who wrote a book called The Prince. Then you have William Shakespeare, who wrote plays like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and A Midsummer Night's Dream. You also have a guy named Miguel Cervantes, who we don't have pictured here, but he wrote the story of Don Quixote. Now, one of the most important or significant technological advances of the Renaissance period was the printing press. It was invented by a German man named Johann Gutenberg, which combined ideas of the old Chinese movable type with new ideas of movable type. And you come up with this thing that's printed, mass-produced books. And again, one of the reasons why the humanist movement really emerges is through the mass production of Bibles. Because if you remember with Martin Luther, he believes that you don't need a minister to tell you about God. You can read it yourself in the Bible. And that was printing press really helped push that idea, because Bibles were mass produced and everyone could own one now. You didn't have to go to church to read the Bible. That is the end of section 1.